All right, let's get started. Thank you for joining us for the first monthly webinar of the 2017. My name is Connor Wrighton, and I am the Communications Manager for the Northwest Gas Association. As we look back on the past few months, it's clear that the theme has been the shocking results of the 2016 election cycle and the political uncertainty that has followed, which is why we're so pleased to have John Horvick of DHM Research here to help us get a better sense of what happened in November and perhaps what that may mean for the public sentiment going forward. Before we begin, let's go over some of the basics of how these webinars work. We've set aside some time for questions, and we strongly encourage you to ask them as they come up. Each of you will be muted throughout the presentation, so please use the text box to type in your questions, and I will interject as needed to introduce the questions. If you can see the GoToMeeting control panel, you should be able to see the chat function near the bottom of that. If anyone is interested in getting a PDF copy of this presentation, John has given us permission to send that along. Please send me an email at creiten@nwga.org, and I'd be happy to send you a copy before the close of business today. We are also recording, and I will get this up to our YouTube page here within an hour of the end of this, and I can send that link as well. Some of you may know the NWGA hosts webinars like this one on the last Thursday of each month. We're currently ironing out our 2017 webinar schedule, and we anticipate we'll be in touch via email in the next week or so as we finalize the details of our next webinar, which we believe will take place on February 23rd at noon. Also, the 2017 Annual Energy Conference is quickly approaching, and we ask that each of you mark off the 7th and 8th of June, as we hope to see all of you then at Skamania Lodge. Finally, I want to introduce the NWGA to those of you who might not be familiar with us and what we do. We represent the 6 investor-owned gas utilities operating in the Pacific Northwest, along with the 3 large natural gas transmission lines. Our members are located in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. And as always, please visit our website at nwga.org for more information, or send me an email at creiten@nwga.org. And without further ado, I'm going to pass things along to John here in just a moment. John, everything looks good, but I think you may be still on mute. Sorry about this, everyone. We will get this ironed out here in the next minute or two, and we will get started as soon as we can get the audio working.
Connor?
Yes.
Anybody? Ah, there we go.
All right, there
All
we
right.
are. Let's
Connor,
get.
can you see my screen? Oh, share the screen again, please.
Yep. One moment. We will get you the screen, and we will get started here.
All right.
All right, there we go. Thanks.
We good to go, folks? Sorry about the delay. I'm a rookie at this. I appreciate your patience. While Connor was setting up and I was talking into the air, I was saying I want to thank Connor for the introduction and the opportunity to speak with all of you, to share some of my thoughts and some of our research that we've done leading up to the election, and some thoughts I have going forward. Just a bit about DHM, and then I'll tell you a bit about what my goal is here. DHM Research, we're an independent and nonpartisan public opinion and policy firm. We're based in Portland, Oregon, but we do work across the Northwest and across the country, really focusing on policy issues, political issues, and so it's a position where we get to spend our time asking people what sort of communities they want to live in, and we do that with quantitative research surveys. We do that with a lot of qualitative research as well. So we bring those various perspectives to our work. So today, I want to do a few things. First, I want to lay the groundwork and share some of our research and some other data. Just how are people feeling? What is the broad mood of the public? Some of it is, of course, going to lead into how people voted in this election and what it means, but I have found that it's extremely valuable to help decision makers and leaders like yourselves know some of this basic stuff. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the polling. There's a belief, and perhaps merited, but perhaps not, that the polling in this election was wrong. And I want to give you some numbers around that, both to let you know what the polling did get right and what it missed, but I think it frames how people think about the election and what it means, and they tell stories about why the outcome ended up the way it did, in part because they're viewing it through a perception that the polling missed in some particular ways. Then I'm going to talk about why I think the election turned out the way it did, why it maybe wasn't as surprising as people may imagine. Then I'm going to touch a bit on some statewide issues, particularly in Oregon and Washington, just to round things out. So that's the goal. So how are people feeling? Well, pollsters like me and many others like to ask this standard benchmark question. All things considered, is the United States, or in this case Oregon, or say the city of Seattle, headed in the right direction, or are things off on the wrong track? We like it because it's been asked thousands and thousands of times over several decades, and so we have a real good sense of what the trends lines are and why things move and what it means when they do. But just to set things up, here are numbers in Oregon from DHM's research since going back to 2001. And I picked 2001 because that was really the high watermark if I go back the last couple decades. And at the time, this is 2001, we did a survey just before September 11th, so really just a couple days before. And at that moment, 66% of Oregonians said that the state was headed in the right direction. You would have seen similar numbers in Washington or Idaho. Numbers would be lower in the country, as they always are, but relatively high compared to where we are now. After September 11th and the recession in the early 2000s, the right direction number in Oregon fell to 21%. Not surprising, we all remember why. And the numbers have bounced around since then. They picked up through the mid-2000s as the economy started to really get going and the housing market was on fire, and then crashed along with the housing market in the late 2000s, and have been inching upwards, a little bit unsteady since then. Now, our most recent numbers in early 2017 in Oregon were that 45% of voters here thought that the state was heading in the right direction. If we look back since 2001, the average has been in the mid-30s right direction numbers, and so we're a little bit above average for the last 15 or so years, but considerably below the high point in the early 2000s. So that's just some context, and I want you to keep these numbers in mind because I'm going to show you a similar slide again that will paint a different picture about these numbers. So broadly, people are feeling okay. We see similar numbers in Oregon, Washington, and other states tend to be higher at the local level and, of course, lower nationally. The other big picture question that we ask is, how worried are you about your personal financial situation? Obviously, how people feel about pocketbook issues strongly informs their political perspectives and desires. And I like this particular question, how worried are you about your personal financial situation, rather than questions about the economy generally, because questions about the economy generally are very, very highly correlated to party affiliation. And that's not the case with your personal financial situation. So sometimes when we're measuring how people feel about the economy, we're really measuring how people feel about the president. This is a better indicator. And you can see that in 2011, about 2/3 to 7 out of 10, these are Oregonians, but you see similar numbers in the rest of the Northwest, said that they were somewhat or very worried about their personal financial situation. You know, it started to fall just a bit 2013, 2014, 2015, and then really in 2016 we've seen a remarkable move downward where people are telling us that they're less concerned about their personal financial situation. That's really good news. We're going to ask this question again this next month, so we'll see how things have changed after the election. But a very strong indicator of positivity in the Northwest, at least with regards to the economy. But it's not all good news. There is real concern that still exists out there, and this is just one measure. We asked in a statewide Oregon survey again whether or not people whether or not their household was affordable, using the HUD's definition that the question explained what this meant. And 26%, or 1 out of 4 Oregonians, said that their housing situation was not affordable. Now, especially in Oregon and Washington, we have seen the question of housing affordability, and related issues with homelessness skyrocket in terms of importance and concern. It's a really powerful motivator at the state and local level here in the Northwest. And as much as we've seen some broad improvements with the economy, this is a real drag on people's positive feelings about politics and their personal concerns. So just some other benchmark numbers, things that I think are real important to keep in mind. First, right now, Oregon's unemployment rate is 4.6%. Again, these are Oregon numbers where I'm based, but you see similar numbers across the Northwest. So that's unemployment. The median household income in the state, at least in 2014, the most recent numbers, $50,500. And those are the two numbers that get told the most frequently as measures of our economy. But when I travel across the Northwest doing focus groups, there's a different story that isn't captured in this, and it's really people's financial security. And I want to share with you some what I think are real powerful numbers. So unfortunately, there's not state-level numbers for this, but at the national level, median household wealth, that's all your assets minus your debts, is $81,000. But there are tremendous and important differences by race. So in the United States, white households have a median household wealth of $142,000, compared to Hispanics at just $14,000 and African Americans at just $11,000. I think it's really important to keep these numbers in mind when we think about who the electorate is, what the economy means, and how people decide to vote and organize, and what policies they want to prioritize. There are tremendous and stark differences on wealth that aren't captured in income or employment that exists in the country. And then one other, I just find this important to share with audiences like yourself, because there's, I think, a real estimate of how similar we tend to be to the average voter. And one way that manifests is with college attainment. So in Oregon, 30% of adults 25 and older have a college degree. 30%. Now, I suspect many of you listening in do, and many or maybe even most of you have graduate degrees. Well, in Oregon, 11% of adults have a graduate degree, which is the same percentage of Oregonians who have not graduated high school. I think we often spend time thinking and talking about policy and politics with people like ourselves, and I suspect many of you have degrees far advanced of the typical Oregonian. So just some numbers to keep in mind as we think about the electorate and how they voted and what their priorities are. Now, another way to look at how people are feeling is their perceptions of government and its effectiveness. And we like to ask these questions about once a year in surveys. And again, we've asked these in Oregon and Washington. Just my most recent numbers here are from Oregon, but you see the same sort of story no matter where we ask. One is just how many cents out of every dollar the state spends do you feel benefits your daily life? And then on the flip side, how many cents out of every dollar the state spends do you feel is wasted? On the benefits your daily life, it's just 30 cents on the dollar. And of course, there are differences by party, but Democrats don't believe that even a majority of the dollar benefits their daily life. And so these opinions are pretty widespread, even across party affiliation. On the other side, more Oregonians believe that the state wastes their dollar than spends it in a way that benefits them. So 30 cents benefits, 44 cents feel is wasted. So just building the story here, people are becoming a little bit more positive about the direction of the state. Perhaps they're feeling a bit better about their personal financial situation. There are real differences across the state around economic security, even as employment numbers have improved, and remains a real perception that the state and government is wasteful and not spending money wisely. So that picture is then combined with the fact that voters are woefully uninformed about the basics of how government works. So again, statewide Oregon surveys, we ask these basic questions about once a year. Can you name the 3 branches of government? And just 50% can name the 3 branches of government, or said another way, 50% cannot name the 3 branches of government. In Oregon, the primary source of state revenue is income taxes. 65% of Oregonians cannot name income tax as a primary source of state revenue. Now, you're all from different states and you have different tax systems, but in Oregon, just as many Oregonians believe that property taxes are the primary source of state revenue as they're likely to say income taxes. Property taxes, of course, fund local government. And just on another issue, we see between 30 and 60% of Oregonians cannot name the source of their drinking water. So not well informed about how government works, not well informed about basic infrastructure, and cynical about whether or not government is effective. So those are some elements of the public that we work with and who voted in our last election. All right, how are people feeling? Again, we see a real sense of, I'll call it nostalgia in the electorate. And these are Oregon numbers, but they match similar questions that have been asked in national surveys. The one question we asked is agree or disagree, I don't recognize my country anymore. 53% of Oregonians agree to that. And I want to draw your eye down to the college, non-college, which is the bars at the bottom, where 64% of Oregonians who do not have a college degree agree to that statement, compared to 39% of those who do have a college degree. Another question, people like me are no longer valued in America. Again, a majority of Oregonians feel that way, 52%, but pay attention, that college, non-college there at the bottom, just the tremendous differences in how those with a degree and those without view their place in American society right now. All right, so that's big picture. Now I want to move to the polls. I'm a pollster, of course, and so a lot of people have been asking me, why did the polls get things so wrong? I'm here to tell you that story hasn't been told quite as well as it should. So if we look back to elections going back to 1968, and if you can average the polls that were done throughout the election cycle and compare to how the final outcome ended, we compare how the polls did to the final outcome. And you can see in 1968, the polls were only 0.5% off from the actual election outcome. In 1972, they were 1.9% off from the national outcome. And you can see across these different elections, the polls nationally have been remarkably accurate. On average, they've just missed the actual vote count by 1.9 percentage points. If you can talk to a few hundred or 1,000 Americans out of several hundred million and predict how they're going to behave on one day and only be off on average across time by 1.9 percentage points, that's a pretty remarkable feat. Well, if we look to 2016, nationally, the national polls were only off 1.1 percentage points from the election outcome. The national polls predicted that Hillary Clinton would win by about 3 percentage points, about 4 percentage points, and she won the national popular vote. They predicted that she would win by 3 percentage points. She won by 2 percentage points, and so they were only off by 1.1% nationally, which actually was an improvement from 2012, where the polls were off by 2.7%. The difference, of course, is in 2012 the polls predicted that Barack Obama would win, and he did. And in 2016 they predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the presidential election, and she didn't by virtue of the Electoral College. So historically the polls were as good or better nationally in 2016 than they had been in previous elections. Of course, the story with presidential elections is at the state level. And here is where there's a more complicated polling story to tell. I've polled out 11 swing states, and you could look at different states that you might consider swing states, but pull out 11 and looked at the polling average in those states compared to the actual outcome. And you can see pretty clearly that the big misses were in the Rust Belt states. Ohio, 6.6 percentage points off. And then, of course, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania were off by a significant amount. And it's because the polls were wrong in some selective states that that the election was presumed to go one way and turned out another way. But there are good reasons for that were not well explained during the election or after the election. And the most significant reason, the undertold story, is there was much more uncertainty in the polls this year than in previous elections. So this slide shows the percentage of voters who were undecided or planned to vote for a third party in the 2020, 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2016 election. The gray bar are what the polls said 100 days before the election, and the yellow bar is what the polls said on election day. Now, if we pay attention to on the election day, the yellow bars, you can see 12.5% of the national polls were still undecided going into the voting booth or in the day of the election, compared to just 4.3% in 2012 and 3.6% in 2008 and just 3.4% in 2004. Because so many people were undecided, there was much more uncertainty in the electorate than what was discussed in the media. The media talked about Clinton having a 3 or 4 or 5% lead over Trump, but largely ignored in the conversation the large number of voters who were undecided or considering a third party. And if we look at those key states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Clinton actually met or beat her pre-election polling numbers in those states, but Trump did by even more because those undecided voters strongly broke his way. And that is something that the polling can't do a whole lot about, but in terms of it's very difficult to predict what an undecided voter is going to do. Are they going to show up? How are they going to cast their ballot? Are hard things to do. One of the things that pollsters need to do a better job at in the future, and the media as well, is being more clear about the don't knows and the undecideds, and being able to explain that elections are perhaps more uncertain than just that top line number would suggest. So I share that polling information with you because I think that because the outcome turned out unexpectedly, it has allowed people to fill in their favorite story or their pet hypothesis about why things went the way that they did. And I want to tell you to beware of hot takes. And we've seen, I'm sure, many of these, the explanations that it was economic anxiety, that it was this urban-rural culture divide, the email scandal, the missing white voter, racism, sexism, Russian intervention, WikiLeaks, media failure. It was just brilliant marketing. It was the James Comey and the FBI. It was an out-of-touch media. It was the year of the outsider, or there's a lack of policy debate. All these are explanations for why the outcome was unexpected. I want you to keep a few things in mind. First, this election really did feel different, and I want to acknowledge that. Perhaps, though, it wasn't as different as people make it out to be, and I'll explain in a second. Two, we are a very, very closely divided country, and these elections are really on a knife's edge. We're extremely partisan, and we vote for our party. And also, I'm going to make the case that the change is greater at the top than the changes below, and I'll share with you what I mean with that in a few minutes. So it really did feel different. I want to acknowledge that. So we've been asking over the last year this question. When I think about the 26th presidential election, I feel either happy, sad, angry, or fearful. And right in a couple months before the election, just 3% said that they were happy versus 17% sad, 28% angry, and 46% who said that they were fearful. So this election did feel different. We had different candidates, different issues, and it did feel different. But in a lot of ways, the numbers, the results, the closeness was baked in. And one way to think about this is just how closely we are in partisanship. So these numbers come from Gallup and their monthly surveys asking how people identify their party affiliation. And you can see these go from 2004 to 2017. The blue lines, of course, are Democrats, and the red line is Republicans. But you can see in the last couple of years, Democrats, Republicans are just neck and neck. We are very, very closely divided by party identification now, more so than we have been before. And we've had a string of very, very close elections. So in 2016, the national popular vote, again, Clinton won by 2 percentage points, which is about what we've seen in the last several cycles. The only outlier really is 2008, where Barack Obama won by 7.3 percentage points. So this election, we're very closely divided by party. This election, national popular vote, is very consistent with past elections. Again, it feels different because of the candidates, but if we close our eyes and just think of D versus R, this was a pretty status quo sort of outcome. Another way to look at it is just how different demographic groups voted. And so this is the Democratic share of the vote in 2016, which is the dark blue bars sort of up front versus the shaded bars below is the 2012. And you can see that a couple of things. First, Clinton did worse among males and did slightly worse among these various ethnic and racial groups. And it was enough to make a difference, particularly in swing states. But the pattern is very similar. The pattern is very similar. We can see it too, where the biggest differences are really around income, especially the low income levels. But these are differences in degree, I would argue, rather than differences in kind. Now, we have winner-take-all elections, and so they made all the difference in the outcome. But when we think about who American voters are, many of the patterns are just really ingrained in our voting, and were very similar in 2016 as they were in 12, and in 2008, 2004, and the years before. When I said we were partisan, one sort of way to demonstrate that is the percentage, in this case, of Democrats who voted for the Republican presidential candidate. These numbers come from exit polls going back to the 1970s, and you can see in 1972, 37% of self-identified Democrats voted for the Republican. In 1976 through 1984, about a quarter of self-identified Democrats voted for the Republican. In 88, nearly 1 in 5 did that. And then it really dropped off in 1992, and now virtually no Democrats vote for the Republican candidate. And the same chart would be true for the Republicans. Virtually no Republicans vote for the Democratic candidate. And that matched with the fact that we're very, very closely divided by party ID. One of the either consequences of or reasons for, it's hard to disentangle, for the fact that Democrats are so partisan, Republicans are so partisan, is that we view the other party much more negatively now than we did in the past. And so Pew has been asking this question on a yearly basis going back to 1994. Do you have a very favorable, somewhat favorable, somewhat unfavorable, or very unfavorable opinion of Democrats and Republicans? And these are the very unfavorable opinions. So in 1994, just 17% of Democrats had a very unfavorable opinion of Republicans. 21% of Republicans had a very unfavorable opinion of Democrats. But now a majority of Democrats and Republicans have a negative view of the other. And if that's the way we're thinking about each other, it's very difficult to imagine that we would consider voting for the opposite party in a presidential election. And you can see it really in another way too. We asked this question in a survey. If Trump won or Clinton won, this is before the election, will we get through things okay, or will there be real damage? Well, 91% of Clinton voters said that there's going to be real damage if Trump wins. On the other side, 97% of Trump supporters said that there'd be real damage if Clinton wins. We are in our corners and seeing the worst of each other. Another way that I can demonstrate this is we asked in a survey, we asked Clinton supporters to describe Trump supporters. This is in their own words. So we listened to what they had to say. We took all their comments down, and this is just a word cloud. But they used words like ignorant and idiots and uneducated, crazy, disrespectful, bigots. These are the words that our neighbors said about our neighbors. And the big one there, uninformed. But what did Trump supporters have to say about Clinton supporters? That they're ignorant, that they're stupid, that they're deceived, corrupt, stubborn, pathetic, idiots and liars, and misinformed. And that's one of my favorite things about this particular result is that Clinton supporters thought that Trump supporters were uninformed, they didn't know anything, where Trump supporters thought that Clinton supporters were misinformed, or they knew the wrong things. I think that says a lot about our electorate. But we're in an environment where we really are seeing the worst of each other. Part of the reason for that is that we just don't know each other. So these are Oregon numbers again, but I'm sure that they would be true in other parts of the country. Certainly it's true in the Northwest, but we asked voters in Oregon if they have a lot or some friends who are supporting Hillary Clinton for president, and just 32% of Trump supporters had a lot or some friends who were Clinton supporters. And on the flip side, just 12% of Clinton supporters said that they had a lot or some friends who were supporting Donald Trump. We have isolated ourselves geographically and with our peer networks where we're just not interacting with those who are seeing things from the other side. Of course, that builds into that fear and anger that I talked about before, and also our disbelief, or many people's disbelief in the election outcomes, in part because they just were incapable of seeing what the other side was seeing because they're just not interacting with them. Of course, one of the important factors in any election to keep in mind is that elections are choices. They're not referendums. And when any explanation of Trump's victory has to keep in mind that he was running against Hillary Clinton. And these are the favorable, unfavorable numbers for Trump and Clinton, national polling averages the days before the election. And these are extremely highly unfavorable numbers. Now, the question I have as a pollster and as an observer of voting behavior is, were these unique candidates? That is, did Trump and Clinton have such high unfavorable numbers because they were Trump and Clinton? Or is this the new normal? Are we so partisan and polarized in our perspectives that regardless of who the candidates are, we're going to, in the future, see negatives like this in the future? I don't know, but it is a concern of mine and something that we will certainly have to guard against as a society. So earlier, I showed you the right direction, wrong track numbers, and there's a remarkable finding in our data just to show you how partisan we've become in ways that maybe would surprise you. So these are the right direction, wrong track numbers taken over the same period of time as before, but I've broken it out by party. So the blue line, Democrats, right direction responses, yellow line, non-affiliated voters and third party, and the red line, Democrats. And between 2001 and 2008, so George W. Bush's term, on average there was a 9 percentage point difference in right direction responses in Oregon between Democrats and Republicans. Since 2008, that gap has increased to 45 percentage points. So it's not just how we view the president, it's not just how we view national issues. These partisan divides are affecting how we're thinking about issues at the state level too. Now, throughout this entire period in Oregon, there was a Democratic governor, and through much of the period, Democratic legislature. All right, so one other thing, people talk about 2016 as a big change election, and I'm going to say perhaps not as much as we were told to believe, and just a few things to show that. 97% of the United States Congress is reelected. Democrats gained seats in the House and the Senate. Now, they did not pick up majorities in either, and that's where the conversation has focused, but they gained seats. And remember, Clinton won the popular vote. And so if you did not know that Trump was going to win the presidential election, but you said that the Democrats were going to pick up seats in the House and Senate and the Democrats were going to win the national popular vote, you probably would say the Democrats are in a pretty good state politically, nationally. Of course, the outcome would tell you otherwise, but I think it is important to keep these numbers in mind when we think about the state of politics in the country. All right, just a couple big picture issues at the state level. One is on Measure 97. For those of you who are not in Oregon, this was the big tax measure in the state. It had to do with corporate taxes, would have raised about $6 million. But the context for it, so Measure 97 failed, and I'll show you the numbers in a second, but the context for this continues going forward, and we see similar things in other states, and so I want to raise it here for you. One is that if we ask Oregonians, should taxes increase and funding for state programs and services increase, or should we keep rates and service levels the same, or should we cut taxes and cut service levels? Just a quarter of Oregonians say that we should increase tax levels. Just a quarter. But when we ask whether or not individuals, small business or large businesses, are paying about the right amount of taxes, too much or too little, this is where we really see the why Measure 97 was on the ballot in the first place, why there was a heated debate about it, and how politics in Oregon and probably the Northwest are going to be shaped for the foreseeable future. Just 6% of Oregonians think that individuals pay too little. Just 5% think that small businesses pay too little. But 59% think that large businesses pay too little. So even though Oregonians aren't itching for a major tax increase, they do believe that large businesses aren't paying their quote-unquote fair share. And we see this in other ways too when we ask questions about income inequality, about power inequality. We see a real sense out there that large business isn't paying its fair share or doing its part. That really animates so much of the politics here in the Northwest, especially in Oregon. And you can see when I think about what's possible going forward. This was polling that we did on Measure 97 over the last year, and like a lot of ballot measures, it started with relatively solid support at 59% back in November 15. So there is an appetite, perhaps, for this type and level of taxation. However, it's very, very challenged by the fact that it was confusing, that it was a large tax increase, and that there was very well-funded and organized opposition to it. And when that occurs, we saw that the numbers flip rapidly. But the underlying story is perhaps that there's an interest in this type of measure, but not as it was conceived this last go-around. And then in Washington, I think one of the most interesting measures was Initiative 732. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of it. It was a carbon tax proposal, and it was one of the issues that got the most national attention, statewide issues that got the most national attention. These are just some various headlines. You probably know the story. On the liberal left, the environmental community wasn't able to organize. They had differences of opinions about whether the wisdom of this and the way it was conceived. There was some questions about from those really focused on social justice, whether or not the money was funding the right issues, and but nationally there's a lot of interest in this topic, and people were paying attention to Washington. And here's how the polling worked over the last several months. You can see the green dots represent support, and never had especially high support, but support did lead opposition up until October. Now, as a pollster, I'll tell you these aren't particularly good numbers in terms of level of support, but the fact that it was leading opposed until some money was spent against it to campaign against it, tells me this could perhaps be an issue in Washington and other places going forward. I know Governor Inslee has a new version that he's proposing. So I would watch this one to come back, and perhaps the political dynamics will be different in the future if there's more organization, coordination for it. So with that, I will open it up to questions, and I look forward to doing my best to answer them.
Sure, thanks, John. So again, anybody who has any questions, I encourage you to type them into the chat function. We do not have any at this point, but I will give folks about 60 seconds here to type those out. In the meantime, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. Very interesting, and really appreciate your time. So, John, we do have our first question here, and it says, can you address the sharp divergence between King County and the rest of Washington, and the same thing in Oregon?
Well, it's where the liberal voters are. We see this across the country now, where we are sorting by not just race and class anymore, but we're sorting by political ideology. And so urban areas across the country, not just Oregon and Washington, are becoming increasingly liberal, and a bigger gap between the cities and rural areas. If we expand nationally, it's a real problem for Democrats, or put another way, a real advantage for Republicans, that the concentration of liberal voters in large cities is a structural disadvantage for Democrats at the Senate level and in the Electoral College. But it's a trend we're seeing starkly across the country.
Great. So again, as a reminder for folks, this is being recorded and will be up on YouTube here within the next hour. You can respond to the email that I sent out earlier titled NWGA Webinar Sign-In, and if you do that, I will respond with the slide deck as well as the link. In the absence of any other questions, again, I just want to say thank you to John, and that we look forward to seeing you all next month on February 23rd. Oh, hang on, we got one more that just came in under the wire here, and it says, how does the country match with Trump's take on environmental protection and climate change?
So, climate change is an interesting one. People, if you look at national polling, Americans believe that climate change is real. Americans believe that we should do something about it. Americans also believe that strongly in supporting renewable energy. And so, in those ways, it's in contrast to what, at least rhetorically, Trump is saying. On the other hand, it is consistently not a top priority for the average voter. And so there's definitely key constituent groups. There are strong advocates around climate change. But for the average voter, it's pretty far down the list of things that they're concerned about and what motivates their voting behavior. And so it's in some ways it's like gun control, like President Trump's and the Republican Party position around gun control in many ways is opposed to where the average voter is. But for the average voter, it's not a voting issue. But for those that it is a voting issue, they're organized around it. And so we'll see how things play out. But despite the fact that polling would suggest that the voters are opposed to some of his policies, unless the average voter organizes around it, there's a lot of a play for the Republicans and Trump, I think, around this issue too.
All right, so we've got a couple of questions that have come in here. So we will start with an interesting one, which is that do you have any data indicating what would have happened if Bernie Sanders had been nominated?
You know, there's been a lot of speculation. There's no way to run that experiment. I think my interpretation is that no matter who the Democrats put up, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, or Joe Biden, pick your Democrat, and no matter who the Republicans put up, Donald Trump, or nominated, Donald Trump, John Kasich, Marco Rubio, it was baked in that this was going to be an extremely close election. Again, Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans vote for Republicans. The closeness, I don't think, would have changed. Now, could have Bernie Sanders picked up another 70,000 voters in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan? Perhaps. May he have lost Hispanic voters in New Mexico and Colorado? Perhaps. We of course don't know. But I think fundamentally, not to say that candidates don't matter, but party ID, partisanship matters a whole lot more. And so I suspect it would have been very close. It's possible it would have been different, but I don't think there's clear evidence that it would have been.
And in your opinion, what are the root causes for the increased political polarization in this country?
Boy, that's a really hard one, and I wish I had a better answer, and I knew other people do as well. But some of the most likely explanations are there is a self-selection about where we choose to live. Liberals in urban areas especially, but within urban areas, within certain neighborhoods. Professionally, there's more sorting as well in terms of what sorts of people choose what professions. And if you want to look it up, there's a really great piece of data on physicians and political opinions of physicians based upon specialty, where family physicians are much more likely to be liberal and many specialists more likely to be conservative. So part of it is our own behavior and choices about where we choose to live and who we choose to associate with. And modern society has allowed us to do that more selectively than in the past, and our opinions are reinforced by who we know. And that's magnified by our media landscape. And with the hope of the internet was that we would be exposed to a much wider breadth of information, and it would have either a moderating effect or an ability to coalesce or to challenge wrong ideas or wrong facts. But in reality, it has allowed us again to self-select, and that ability and then the effect of reinforcing our opinions, I think, goes a long way to making it difficult to see the perspective of the other side and reinforces partisanship.
Well, here's a big one for you. What does all of this mean for the natural gas industry?
Well, Trump is going to have a different suite of policies than Clinton would have. Every indication so far is that regulations are going to decrease, that there will be focus and attention around fossil fuels or American first energy. You know more than I do about the interplay between various energy sources. He's made a big rhetorical push on coal, and so the interaction between coal and natural gas is certainly something to be paying attention to. I don't think it makes much difference in terms of immediate public opinion, but the sorts of policy implications are being signaled by his campaign rhetoric and his early actions in office.
Great. And given this increased partisanship, how do you explain the rise of the independent party?
The rise. Well, there's I'm not sure the independent party. I mean, in Oregon, there is an independent party of Oregon, and I'm not sure if they mean specifically the independent party or if they mean unaffiliated voters. But I'm going to assume it's the latter. People who are identifying as quote-unquote independent or unaffiliated have been on the increase, but that's a trend that goes back really over the last 20 years or so. But the important thing about that is, although people are self-identifying as independent or non-affiliated, that is, they're choosing to not want to say I'm a Democrat or a Republican. However, our voting patterns are more partisan now, even though we're identifying as independent. That is, just because you say you're an independent doesn't mean you go back and forth between voting for Democrats and Republicans. There are liberal independents, there are conservative independents, and they tend to vote in straight line even more so now than in the past. So people don't like parties, and they don't want to personally associate with them, but they're voting for parties consistently.
All right, and here's the last question that we'll go with here. How long would you expect this cycle of closeness amongst the parties to last? Absent some significant catastrophic event, do you see this changing? And what would be a signpost that it is changing?
Well, of course, only guessing here. But I certainly don't see things changing much in the short term because of our electoral system, because the Senate and the Electoral College and the winner-take-all system, it exaggerates small differences. So even to the point where you can lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College. If, say, partisanship or voting patterns changed a percent or two one way or the other, it could it could very sharply change the direction of election outcomes. And so I think that the underlying patterns are not likely to change in the near future, absent something unforeseen. But even if they moved a nudge one direction or other, it can make a big difference in the Congress and the Electoral College, which has a big difference overall. And so a bit of a wishy-washy answer there, but that's my best guess.
Great, and we've only got about 2 minutes here, but we did just get one more question, and I'm going to squeeze it in because I like it, and that's what can we expect from midterm elections in 2018?
Well, I mean, traditionally you would expect the out party to have gains. The Democrats nationally, Democrats are very challenged at the Senate level. They have to defend a lot more seats than do Republicans. So it's way too early to try to project based upon what's happening in the world now. I'd just say that historically the out party tends to pick up seats, and so that in the House I think there's a real opportunity there. But because of the breakdown in the Senate, that'll be a bigger lift, I think, there.
Great. Well, thanks again. Again, everyone, I'll have the link out here in the next few minutes. And thank you again, John, and we'll look forward to next month.
A pleasure to talk to you. Thank you all.
All right. Bye.